When I'm on tour with guests and tell them that Berlin is around 800 years old, there are two different reactions. On the one hand, an "oh wow," which usually comes from guests from the USA, or on the other hand, a weary shrug of the shoulders. Age is relative, and in fact, Berlin is one of the latecomers among European metropolises. When other cities such as London, Paris, or Cologne could look back on more than 1,000 years of history, the first people were just settling here permanently. In the first 400 years, it started relatively slowly, but then Berlin developed a really brisk pace. Hello and welcome. My name is Michael Rost, professional tour guide in Berlin, and in this video I would like to show the urban development of Berlin from its foundation until around 1840, using historical maps and pictures. I will mention the most important events and also the buildings that are still visible in the cityscape today. So if you are interested in the history and urban development of Berlin, you've come to the right place. Only at the end of the 12th century did permanent settlement begin, where the Nikolaikirche and the Spree Island are today. Traveling merchants set up two trading points on the banks of the Spree, Berlin and Cölln. The river here was shallower and easier to cross, and it was here that trade routes crossed. The oldest finds date back to 1170. Cölln was first mentioned in a document in 1237, followed by Berlin in 1244. There had been Slavic settlements in this region before. The name Berlin is therefore also derived from the Slavic and means something like swamp or damp place. Three rivers converge in the greater Berlin area: Spree, Dahme und Havel. This ensured a good transport connection. The name Cölln probably comes from immigrants from the Rhineland. While mighty cathedrals were being built in other cities, here a late Romanesque pillar basilica made of field stone was being built, the St. Nicholas Church, of which today only the tower base reminds of the origins. A few decades later, the St. Mary's Church was added. The medieval twin towns quickly developed into an important trading center of the time, and in 1360, Berlin-Cölln became a member of the Hanseatic League until 1516. The number of inhabitants grew slowly from 1250 to 1450, from about 2,000 to 8,000 inhabitants, living on an area of 0.7 square kilometers, so a little more than the area of today's Europa City. Between 1443 and 1451, the Berlin Palace was built against the will of the Twin City, which forfeited political and economic freedoms. The castle had a defensive character and was used to control the trade routes. In 1486, Elector Johann Cicero made the castle in Cölln the permanent residence of the Brandenburg electors from the House of Hohenzollern. The development into a resident city brought an increase in political importance, but at the same time a further loss of urban freedoms. In 1500, Berlin had about 12,000 inhabitants. In 1537, the castle was demolished, and a Renaissance-style residential palace was built on its foundations. In 1539, the Reformation began in Brandenburg. Elector Joachim II took communion for the first time according to the Lutheran rite in Spandau's St. Nicholas Church. Council and citizens of Berlin and Cölln followed. The 30 Years' War raged in Europe from 1618 until 1648, and several armies invaded Berlin, including a Swedish army with 12,000 men. Looting and killing were followed by dysentery and plague. At the end of the 30 Years' War, the population of Berlin-Cölln had halved to 6,000, and most of the houses had been destroyed. City and country were in a desolate state. In 1640, Elector Friedrich William I, who grew up in Holland with his uncle, took over the regency. After the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, he had the devastated country rebuilt with consistency and an iron hand, had comprehensive reforms carried out, built up a standing army, and had begun targeted efforts to recruit immigrants. After defeating the Swedes in 1667 at the Battle of Fehrbellin, he was called the Great Elector. In 1652, the Memhard Plan, the oldest Berlin city plan, was created, Johann Gregor Memhard, a military man, landscape planner, draftsman and politician, during and after the 30 Years' War, was appointed court architect in Berlin by the Great Elector in 1650 and was also responsible for planning the fortifications around Berlin a few years later. If you look at the area shown on the map today, you can only see a few buildings and places which are still there. The St. Nicholas and St. Mary's Church, the area of the Berlin Palace with the pleasure garden which extended to the top of today's Museum Island. The historical pattern of streets and squares was largely erased during and after the Second World War, and between the oldest churches in Berlin there is an emptiness that cannot be found in the centre of any other European metropolis. Archaeologists have been digging for several years now where Berlin's oldest marketplace once was, the Molkenmarkt, the Way Market. They are uncovering the origins of the city layer by layer. Afterwards, the area will probably be built over in a modern way. From 1658 to 1688, a massive star-shaped fortress with 13 bastions was built around Berlin. If you take the S-Bahn, the rapid urban train, between Museum Island and Janowitzbrücke today, you follow the course of the former fortifications. The avenue laid out between the city palace and the Tiergarten, the former royal hunting ground, which later became Unter den Linden Street, was still outside the fortifications. Friedrichswerder was founded as an independent city in 1662 and was named after the Great Elector, Friedrich Wilhelm. In 1671, Jewish families expelled from Vienna were allowed to settle in Berlin. The Jewish community was founded and by 1700 had grown to 114 families with over 1,000 people. A year later, the Huguenot community in Berlin was founded, initially with 100 members. In 1674, the Dorotheenstadt was founded as a new town, and in 1681 it was named after the Electress Dorothea. In 1685, Friedrich Wilhelm issued the Potsdam Edict of Tolerance. 20,000 of the Huguenots persecuted in France because of their religious beliefs settled in the Mark Brandenburg, 6,000 of them in Berlin alone. The Huguenots thus made up almost a quarter of Berlin's population at the end of the 17th century. They brought manual skills such as silk manufacture and spinning with them, as well as new foods. Berliners got to know asparagus, strawberries and the like. One could almost say that the Huguenots were civilizing Berlin. Economy, trade and culture were experiencing a sustained upswing. The following map by the French engineer Lavigne from 1685 shows Berlin and the surrounding area. Here you can already see the beginnings of the later big city. Charlottenburg is on the left. Below are the villages of Wilmersdorf and Schöneberg. On the right, the Kreuzberg Hill. In the middle, the Tiergarten area. In 1688, Friedrichstadt came into being, initially on paper, as a modern city with a chessboard floor plan and a regular system of streets intersecting at right angles. Elector Frederick III named it after himself, and in 1691 it received city rights. Many Huguenots settled here and had a formative influence. In 1701 the foundation stones for the French and German churches were laid here, which were completed in 1705 and 1708. On January 18, 1701, Elector Frederick III crowned himself king in Königsberg. He called himself Frederick I in Prussia. Berlin became a royal residence. In order to underline his new importance, he had the Berlin Palace expanded into a huge Baroque palace. An extremely ambitious project considering the size and importance of Berlin at the time. Architecture of European standing was being created in Berlin for the first time. The armory, the arsenal of weapons, was built as early as 1695. In 1709, King Friedrich I decreed that the 5 independent cities of Berlin, Cölln, Friedrichswerder, Dorotheenstadt and Friedrichstadt should be united to form the capital and residential city of Berlin. The united city had 55,000 inhabitants. For comparison, London and Paris had about 600,000 inhabitants, Vienna 115,000 at that time. The city area tripled to 6.26 square kilometers. Around 1730 the city was expanded in the Baroque style. The 3 striking squares that border the new area to the west and south were given geometric shapes. the Quarré, today Pariserplatz at the Brandenburg Gate, the Octagon, today Leipziger Platz, and the Rondell, today Mehringplatz. Generous and prestigious buildings were planned there, and the most important aristocratic mansions were built on Wilhelm Street. In the north, east, and south, outside the city gates, suburbs with irregular street layouts were growing. Today you can only see the old structure in the Spandau suburbs, the so-called Bonds Quarter, around Hackischer Markt. The Sophian Church, built there in 1712, received its Baroque tower in 1732. From 1732 to 1739, religious refugees from Bohemia came to Berlin. In 1737 they founded Böhmisch Rixdorf, today's Neukölln. Between 1734 and 1737 the fortifications were demolished and replaced by a 14.5-kilometer-long customs wall. Berlin had 80,000 inhabitants and covered an area of 13.3 square kilometers, which remained almost unchanged for the next 100 years. From 1740 onwards, with Friedrich II, a king who was interested in the arts and architecture took over the regency. As early as 1742, the first freestanding opera house was built outside of a palace in Germany. In 1756, the Prince Heinrich Palace followed for his brother, only half the size originally planned by the king. Then came St. Hedwig's Cathedral in 1773 and the Old Royal Library in 1780. The Forum Fridericianum, or Bebelplatz, is the only place in Berlin where you can still feel transported back to the 18th century. In 1770, the bridle path laid out in 1647 from the city palace to the Tiergarten was expanded into a boulevard. What is meant, of course, is Berlin's well-known avenue Unter den Linden. In 1785, the dome towers of the German and French church were completed. At the time of Frederick the Great's death in 1786, Berlin had 145,000 inhabitants, and the city was in the transition from late Baroque to early Classicism. In 1791, the Brandenburg Gate, designed by Karl Gotthard Langhans, was inaugurated, and in 1793 the Quadriga, created by Johann Gottfried Schadow, was added. There's a detailed video of me on the construction of the Brandenburg Gate. In 1800, Berlin had around 170,000 inhabitants. If you look at the map from 1798 and compare it with that of 1685, you can see that although Berlin had grown, the surrounding area had hardly changed, with the exception of Charlottenburg perhaps. In 1805, the Ox Market and Parade Ground located directly in front of the former fortifications was named Alexanderplatz, in honor of the Russian Tsar Alexander I, who was in Berlin in October 1805. On October 27, 1806, Napoleon and his troops entered Berlin through the Brandenburg Gate. The city remained occupied by French troops until December 1808. French foreign rule in Prussia did not end until 1814. If you want to know more about this time and the robbery of the Quadriga, watch my second video about the Brandenburg Gate. In 1809, the new Prussian town ordinance developed by Baron von Stein came into force and granted Berlin far-reaching self-government rights. In 1810, Berlin's first university, today's Humboldt University, was opened in the Prince Heinrich Palace on Unter den Linden. In 1820, Berlin had over 200,000 inhabitants. The most important master builder in Berlin in the first decades of the 19th century was Karl Friedrich Schinkel. Here are his most important buildings. In 1816, the Neue Wache, the new guardhouse, was completed. This was followed in 1821 by the new theatre on Gendarmenmarkt, in 1824 by the Castle Bridge, and in 1830 by the Friedrichswerder Church. Also in 1830, the old museum on the Spreeinsel was opened as the first functional museum building in Prussia. What the cityscape of Berlin looked like at that time has been handed down through panoramas that show the view from the roof of the Friedrichswerder Church. It was painted by the Vedute painter Eduard Gärtner in 1834. You can see the late Baroque townscape with mostly three-story buildings. Only the castle and the church towers stand out. To the southwest, you can see the new theatre on Gendarmenmarkt. To the east, the old museum and the old cathedral, rebuilt by Schinkel. Another section clearly shows Schinkel's late work, and at the same time most modern building, the Building Academy. It had a major impact on the architecture of public buildings in Berlin and Prussia, and even beyond Europe. There is no important place in Berlin without a building by Schinkel. This illustrates the enormous workload of the architect, which also corresponded to the rapid development of Berlin at the time. Between 1810 and 1840, the number of buildings in the city tripled. By the beginning of the 19th century, Berlin had managed to become one of the most important cities in Europe. As the royal seat of residence, Berlin had 55,000 inhabitants. In 1710 and in 1747, Berlin reached 100,000 for the first time, making it a major city. 70 years later, in 1820, there were already 200,000 residents. But that was only the beginning of a much more rapid development in the 19th century. But that is no longer the subject of this video. I will deal with that in detail in my next video on the emergence of Greater Berlin. If you liked the video, please subscribe to my channel or recommend it to others. And you are welcome to support the development of my channel by commenting, liking, or buying me a coffee. Thank you. All the best, and until the next video. Bye.